Welcome to the Political Economy of the Environment videos. I'm Jim Boyce. Today's episode is going to be about safety, efficiency, sustainability, and justice, or what should be the goals of our environmental policies. Goals are normative, not positive. That's philosopher speak for saying goals are things that we prescribe, things that we should say we should do, whereas a positive statement would be a description of what is. Goals involve making value judgments, therefore, not simply describing reality or making theories about the way reality works that can be tested with empirical evidence. For this reason, goals or normative questions are a matter of greater debate often. Not that there aren't debates about how the world works as well, but these are debates about how the world should work. And so to resolve those debates, one can't simply appeal to the factual evidence. One has to come up with one's own values and try to persuade others that those values are good ones, values that make sense from the standpoint of human well-being over the long term. The major goals in environmental policy have been safety, efficiency, sustainability, and justice. And we're going to talk about each of those in turn. They're different from each other. Sometimes they're in conflict with each other. Sometimes they can be combined. Safety has been the major goal of most environmental policies here in the United States and in other countries around the world. An example of a safety goal would be the language of the U.S. Clean Air Act, which was passed in 1970, right around the time the Environmental Protection Agency was created, that entrusted the EPA with the goal of promoting the public health and welfare and productive capacity of the nation's population. That's a safety statement, health and welfare. It didn't say, oh, promote the health of the people insofar as their lives are worth the costs of protecting their lives. No, it said, promote the health of the people. It's a safety goal. Similarly, the Paris Agreement of 2015, the agreement reached by international climate negotiators in that year, was, among other things, to hold the increase in global average temperature to well below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. That's a safety goal. It wasn't a goal that said, well, we should hold it to that insofar as the benefits of doing so exceed the costs. It was saying this is the level that we agree is safe. And going beyond that level in letting the global temperatures increase would be too risky. It would be too unsafe. That's a safety goal as well. This notion of safety as the basis for environmental policy is embedded in some of the most foundational legal documents of the world. For example, the Constitution of Massachusetts says the people shall have the right to clean air and water. That's an amendment that was introduced to the Constitution and passed back in 1972. Similarly, the Constitution of the post-apartheid Republic of South Africa says every person shall have the right to an environment which is not detrimental to his or her health or well-being. That is a clear statement that safety is a basic right and that one of the goals, a primary goal of environmental policy, should be to protect people's health and safety. A second way that environmental goals can be defined, the way that is recommended by many economists, especially those called neoclassical economists, is on the basis of efficiency. Efficiency is a term that actually has multiple meanings, and it's important to understand the difference between the usual meaning of efficiency, which people use in day-to-day speech, and the meaning that neoclassical economists have in mind when they recommend efficiency as the normative criterion on the basis of which we should be deciding how much to protect the environment. The meaning of efficiency that people usually use in day-to-day speech is cost effectiveness. It's about how to get from point A to point B at the lowest possible cost. It's not about deciding whether point B should be where we want to go. We may decide that on the basis of some other criterion, like safety, for example, in the case of environmental protection. And then we could ask the question, what's the most cost-effective way to achieve a certain degree of safety? But the meaning of efficiency as used by neoclassical economists goes well beyond cost effectiveness. It's about not only the means to reaching ends, it's about how to decide what the ends should be. And the way that is done in the neoclassical recommendation for how we decide on our environmental goals is by using what's called cost-benefit analysis, weighing up the costs of environmental protection against the benefits of environmental protection, or conversely, weighing up the benefits of doing things that degrade the environment against the costs of those activities, and deciding what's the efficient level of environmental protection. Cost-benefit analysis got introduced into environmental decision-making in an official way as a result of the executive order issued by President Ronald Reagan within a month after he took office in 1981. He issued an executive order that calls on all, actually requires all federal agencies to subject major rules, what are called major rules, meaning rules of major economic importance, to a cost-benefit test. They have to be able to pass a test that says that the benefits from implementing these rules are going to exceed the costs to society. So overlaid upon the safety goals created by legislation like the Clean Air Act was this executive order that pushed the rules that would protect public health through a cost-benefit or efficiency screen. Among other things, cost-benefit analysis discounts future costs and benefits. Discounting is kind of like an interest rate running in reverse. We have dollars today, we put them in the bank, they earn interest, in 10 years they're worth more. Discounting flips that around. It says, well, costs and benefits 10 years from now aren't worth as much today in what's called present value. So one of the issues in cost-benefit analysis, a critical issue, is how much to discount future costs and benefits. If you discount the well-being of future generations enough, it doesn't matter if we mess up the environment today because those costs are so far away that they're discounted and are outweighed by the benefits to us today. Another key feature of the cost-benefit analyses by which economists decide what is efficient is that they weigh all dollars equally regardless of to whom they accrue, regardless of to whom the costs and benefits that are being measured accrue. So a dollar impact on a millionaire is assessed the same way as a dollar impact on a person who is living below the poverty line. A dollar's a dollar. All dollars are equal, even though that dollar may be, in terms of their utility or well-being, worth a lot more to the person living below the poverty line than to the millionaire who hardly notices another dollar. The goal of cost-benefit analysis is to maximize the size of the dollar pie where all the dollars have been converted via discounting into their present values. So future costs and benefits have been changed into present values, dollar values. Then the costs are subtracted from the benefits to get the net present value that we're out to maximize. That's the efficiency criterion that neoclassical economists suggest should be the goal, the basis for setting the goals of environmental policy. A third normative criterion, a third value system on the basis of which to choose environmental goals is sustainability. And this came into the conversation a bit later in the 80s, among other places in the report of a commission led by the former Norwegian Prime Minister, Gro Brundtland, called after her the Brundtland Commission. And it describes sustainable development as meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. So basically, sustainability is about justice or equity or fairness between generations. It says that, hey, one of the goals of environmental policy should be that we don't leave our children, our grandchildren, and those who will come after them with diminished possibilities of living as well as we live today. Translating that into practice, into operational criteria, is a difficult task. Translating all of these into operational criteria actually is a difficult task. So if we're thinking about what does it mean to pass on to future generations the same ability to meet their needs that we have today, the question becomes, well, how do you measure what we're going to pass on? And one of the measures that's used is the stock of capital. And that's the basis for a distinction, an important distinction in economic debates between what sometimes is called weak sustainability, which means maintaining the total stock of capital, both human-made and natural capital, making sure that future generations have just as much capital stock of both sorts added together that we have today, versus what's called strong sustainability, which means maintaining the stock of natural capital. Which one makes more sense depends on what you think are the possibilities for substituting human-made capital for natural capital. If you think you can basically come up with ways to replace natural resources and the sink functions of the environment with human-made capital, you can substitute away and simply try to maintain the total stock of capital. But if you think that natural capital is irreplaceable, that human-made substitutes are actually inadequate to the task, you may advocate instead strong sustainability. And this is a basic fault line in the economics profession with, on one side, proponents of weak sustainability tending to be neoclassical economists who have a fairly optimistic view of the ways in which we can substitute human-made for natural capital. And on the other side, being folks who call themselves ecological economists who are more skeptical about those possibilities and more inclined to propose strong sustainability as the basis for environmental policy. A central question then is, to what extent can human-made capital substitute for natural capital? And also, we can ask the question, to what extent can different elements of natural capital substitute for each other? If we're going to try to operationalize strong sustainability, we still have to figure out how we're going to combine the different elements of natural capital to decide whether we're maintaining the stock or not. And that involves thinking about to what extent, for example, fish in the ocean can substitute for trees in the forest, or clean air, to take an example. A fourth normative criterion, a fourth basis for defining the goals of environmental policy is justice. And the goal of environmental justice came still later. It was really in the 1990s that this became part of official environmental policy at the federal level and ultimately often at the state level as well. President Bill Clinton in 1994 issued an executive order, Executive Order 12898, that directs all federal agencies to take steps to identify and rectify disproportionately high and adverse human health or environmental impacts of those agencies' programs, policies, and activities on minority populations and on low-income populations. I want to underscore those two categories, minority and low income. There's an overlap, but the notion here is that people have an equal right to a clean and safe environment, and you shouldn't have less environmental quality, less environmental protection, just because you happen to be Black or Latino, or for that matter, poor and white. People should have the same environmental quality. So the goal here is again one of fairness, equity, but within the present generation. It's about intra-generational equity. The reason environmental justice began to be part of the mix in terms of environmental policy goals was that communities that had been victimized by disproportionate environmental harms being imposed upon them began to fight back. And they began to change the balances of power because they got organized and got this onto the policy agenda. Communities like those along so-called Cancer Alley in Louisiana, the stretch of the Mississippi from Baton Rouge down to New Orleans, where a lot of highly polluting industry had been concentrated, having been invited down by the Louisiana State Legislature and given attractive tax breaks for setting up shop there, to the detriment of communities in the area who were predominantly poor and predominantly African American. When people started to organize and say, hey, there's no good reason why our communities should be on the receiving end of so much environmental harm, that's when policymakers ultimately were persuaded that they needed to put injustice into the policy mix as well, as one of the criteria on the basis of which we should decide what is the level of environmental protection that we want to achieve, and where, and how. So in deciding on our goals, our environmental goals, what we really are doing is we're choosing values. We're choosing ethical values. These are ethical questions. And those questions include whether we should value the well-being of all people equally, or whether we should value every dollar equally. It includes whether the right to a clean and safe environment is a right, or in fact, it's more like a commodity, something that should be allocated across people and across communities on the basis of their purchasing power, expressed through their willingness to pay. So those who would pay more for clean air deserve more clean air than others, even though the others may want clean air just as much. They just don't have the money to pay for it. Another value question is what our responsibilities are towards future generations. There aren't testable answers to these questions. It's not like one can establish as a matter of fact, this is right and this is wrong. It's instead about right and wrong in a different sense, an ethical sense, and a sense in which your opinion matters just as much as that of anyone else. Thanks very much.